Why are you after me? What do you want? Azoth. Azoth? Azoth. Essence of life. Of woman.
Among the many survival horror titles during the PS2 era, Haunting Ground is one of the more overlooked titles. It wasn't until only a few years ago that I first played Haunting Ground and was blown away by it. I can see why it has developed a strong following over the course of time. It has some of the best implemented pursuer mechanics in any title, with one pursuer among the very best I've come across. It has my favorite implementation of a dog companion with great bonding system and fantastic AI. It pulls heavily from the Resident Evil and Clock Tower series, creates a familiar yet unique experience that stands out amongst other survival horror titles. It uses body horror and voyeurism to create an unsettling experience, where it leaves a lot of blanks for the players to fill in for themselves. It's very much worth a play if you're a fan of survival horror. While I'm not a huge fan of constant remasters we get these days, Haunting Ground would be a perfect candidate for one due to its limited availability. Developed by Capcom, it released shortly after the game changer that was Resident Evil 4 in the spring of 2005. It ended up selling poorly and became a bit of a collector's item. Buying a copy will fetch a pretty penny on eBay as a result. It released for the PS3 on the PlayStation Store back in 2015, but only in Japan. Else, you could emulate it, as I am here. The PlayStation 2 emulator, PCSX2, has always been a bit spotty, although it has received some notable updates since I last used it, like finally allowing for game-specific settings. The creator of the PS1 emulator DuckStation has been making contributions to it recently. I did upscale the resolution and used a 60 FPS and widescreen hack. It's not perfect, however. There are a number of points where mirror reflections will glitch unless you set the emulator to software mode. The switch to 60 FPS does cause a few issues at points. A couple of times, Hewie wouldn't fetch key items until I turned the game back to 30 FPS. For whatever reason, Fiona's kick is very slow in 60 FPS. Doing alchemy is much more difficult as it's double the speed. You can either switch it back to 30 FPS or just slow down the emulator for these sections. The PCSX2 wiki will give further information on specific settings you'll need to get the best possible experience of playing Haunting Ground. And while it's a rare title, it's not like Haunting Ground has been completely forgotten by Capcom. In Street Fighter V, one of Cammy's unlockable outfits is Fiona's outfit. Come on, Capcom. You've remastered and ported Resident Evil 4 just as much as Skyrim. Plus, you have a remake for it along the way. Not asking for much here. Just a little bit of upscaling and 60 FPS to play nicely with modern hardware. How Haunting Ground, or Demento as it's called in Japan, came to be is a bit of a mashup of being tied to Clock Tower 3 and Resident Evil 4. A number of staff at Capcom who worked on Clock Tower 3 worked on Haunting Ground. It contains a number of similar elements from the Clock Tower series. Some of these elements include the pursuer system and how your main character can panic. Haunting Ground can be seen as a bit of a spiritual successor to the Clock Tower series. On the note of Clock Tower, I do intend to take a look at the series at some point. I've only played the original on the SNES and greatly enjoyed it. Haunting Ground at one point in time may have been Clock Tower 4, although that's never been confirmed. Some of the concept art gives more of a Clock Tower vibe. Haunting Ground also has some indirect ties to Resident Evil 4. It's not quite to the extent that Devil May Cry came out of earlier builds of Resident Evil 4 though. One of the earlier builds of RE4, known as the Castle or Fog version, had Leon come across a woman who had a dog as a companion. This draft was written by the late Noboru Sugimura. He would pass away shortly before the release of Haunting Ground in the spring of 2005. Since Resident Evil 2, he had worked on a number of Capcom projects, including Clock Tower 3. The Fog iteration of Resident Evil 4 that he wrote would be scrapped. However, elements of this draft were taken and used by a different writer for Haunting Ground. So with that, let's hop into the world of Haunting Ground, which I have to say isn't the greatest title for the game. Same goes for the Japanese title Demento. I think of Dr. Demento as a result. But anyways. In Haunting Ground, we play as Fiona Belli, a young woman. Our goal is to escape from this castle that we are trapped in. It's quite the sprawling castle. It's not quite as interconnected as much as the classic Resident Evil titles, but there are a number of shortcuts we could create along the way as we progress. Though I never found the map to be overly helpful. You will get a feel for things as you make your way through. And it's not like you're returning all the way back to the beginning at points. For each pursuer, we will have a section of the castle where they will chase us around. There are a number of puzzles along the way. Some are fairly straightforward, some take a little more thought, and some will make use of our companion. Haunting Ground keeps enemies to a bare minimum. The ones that we'll primarily deal with are the pursuers. The game is essentially broken up into 5 acts. During each act, we will be chased by one pursuer at a time within an area. I find it's one of the better uses of a pursuer system in the game. It builds off what the Clock Tower series did with it. Resident Evil has used this system a number of times, from the original Resident Evil 3 Nemesis and to a lesser extent its remake. 7 and Village made use of it, along with Mr. X in the Resident Evil 2 remake. Alien Isolation is another great example. The entire game is built around the system, and Haunting Ground pulls it off with grace. You can run into them at any point, although there are certain points along the critical path where they will pop up. The music will fade out as their footsteps approach, and their chase theme will kick in. All of their tracks give off this oh shit feel of getting away from them. Each one has a unique track. From there, we have a number of options. We could kick them or charge them, but this does next to nothing. Throughout our journey, we could find or concoct items that we could toss or place on the ground to temporarily stun our pursuers. This gives you time to run away. What's great is how the music will change depending on their proximity. If they're closer, the music will be louder and faster tempo. Get some distance between you and them, and the music fades out and slows down. On a technical front, save for booting up the game and cutscenes, there are no loading screens in Haunting Ground. Going room to room is seamless. What they were able to pull off on the PlayStation 2 here is damn impressive of pushing the system to its limits. The best option is to get some distance from our pursuers and hide. There are a number of hiding spots like under a bed or in a closet. Although if you use the same spot too many times, they will catch on to it. One that could work surprisingly well is simply hiding behind a door. It would amuse me that something like this can work so well at various points. While Haunting Ground keeps a bare-bones interface, I didn't like how "the coast is clear" message would appear once pursuers were gone. In some cases, it could be fairly unreliable. The chase music fading out and the normal background music returning is a much better indicator of being safe. Of course, these chases are not just straightforward. Fiona will begin to panic in these situations. Keeping with the minimal HUD approach, the screen begins to blur, her heart beats faster, with the controller vibrating. When running, she could stumble over. If things get worse, like getting hit by a pursuer, we'll go into full-blown panic mode. We can control what direction Fiona goes, but that's it. She runs and stumbles over. This is a tough aspect to pull off. Make it too easy and it doesn't add any tension. Make it too frustrating, the game becomes a slog. But Haunting Ground pulls it off. Full-on panic doesn't last too long. Even when Fiona stumbles, you can have a sense of it coming. Depending on how you play, you could shake off your pursuers fairly quickly, or it may take several minutes. However, I didn't come across any times where I'd roll my eyes at another chase. Again, if they don't pop up enough, they lose that tension. If they pop up too often, it becomes a frustrating affair. I found the balance of encounters to be just right. I'm curious to know what's going on with the AI behind the scenes here of how this gets determined. And there are certain sections of Haunting Ground where we won't be pursued, like doing some of the puzzles. There are a couple of minor enemies we'll come across in Haunting Ground. If we run into them, they'll cause Fiona's panic to increase, and will cause a loud noise, drawing our pursuers to us. They add a bit of variety, but it's one of those things that if they were cut, I wouldn't have minded. Haunting Ground features an alchemy system to create items. Throughout our journey, there are alchemy stations we could use. Making use of medallions, we play this minigame where we try to get as many matching colors in the slots as possible. Different medallions will lead to different colors popping up more often. Some colors are for items to reduce panic, some are throwables to stun enemies, some can create equipment. As I mentioned earlier, playing on 60 FPS makes this really quick. And even on 30 FPS, it's really quick and I always struggled with getting the timing right. Granted, there's plenty of items that we can find in Haunting Ground, so they are not essential to getting through the game. They are nice to have in times of need. But we also have one more trick up our sleeve to help deal with pursuers. And it's this factor that really makes Haunting Ground come together. That being our loyal canine companion, Hewie.
What's your name? Hewie? So you're Hewie. Well, hi, Hewie.
Of all the dog companions in games, Hewie is my favorite. Dee from Phantom Pain? He's cool, but it's not like we're lacking in firepower there. Angelo from Final Fantasy VIII? Sure, he may get shot around like a rocket, but Hewie is still cooler. Plus, Fiona is much more likable than Renoa. Hewie is also one of the best implementations I've seen of an AI companion in a game. AI companions can make or break a game. There's a reason a number of games avoid them. Some are based around escorting. Think Ashley in Resident Evil 4, again tying back to that title. Some are more for the narrative, like Elizabeth in Bioshock Infinite. Hewie is your best and most consistent defense in regards to chases from pursuers. He can also find and fetch items, along with detecting traps. And you need to build out that relationship with Hewie. He's not going to be obedient right away. Early on, calling for him to follow may go unheeded. He may wander off or lie down. But as Fiona, you could discipline him. Did he listen to you? You could praise him for good behavior. Is he not listening? You could scold him so he doesn't learn that behavior.
Hewie!
You could also feed him treats for a reward, along with shaking a paw. It's all really endearing.
Sit. Shake. Good boy.
And even at the beginning of the game, his disobedience is not too frustrating. The game finds that right balance. Once you progress further in, and if you train him well, he'll be very loyal and obedient. In dealing with pursuers, he can be very effective. He'll also give indication that someone is nearby as he starts to growl. You can get him to stop and time it so he doesn't attack. That will greatly slow them down. There are sections throughout Haunting Ground where we will be separated from Hewie for a time. These moments have much higher tension as our options become much more limited in regards to dealing with pursuers. Haunting Ground Lizard dies on two main factors, the pursuer system and Hewie, and both are pulled off wonderfully. I would love to see more games take a crack at a system like this. Because Haunting Ground wasn't a big hit, there's not a whole lot of information in regards to its AI systems. It's too bad because I'd love to learn more about the AI behind Hewie. One of the unlockables after being Haunting Ground is a mini-game in which we play as Hewie and guide Fiona through an area. While a fun novelty, Fiona's AI is pretty iffy here. As it was a mini-game, there wasn't as much focus put on it. Too bad because I love the idea of it. I think a horror game where you play as an animal companion to guide your owner through could be a really cool idea to play with. And if Hewie looks familiar to you, it's because the same model was used for the dog in Resident Evil 4.
Hey, it's that dog.
Of course, if you want to be a monster, you can mistreat Hewie, which leads to one of the bad endings, but we'll cover that later. So let's now go through Haunting Ground, covering some of the game's highlights, so spoilers ahead. The easy way to break up Haunting Ground is 5 acts, with each one having one pursuer. Act 1 starts off with our protagonist, Fiona, locked up, not knowing where she is. Haunting Ground starts off very linear to introduce the game mechanics and some of the pursuers we will be dealing with. We head upstairs to make our way into the castle, in which we're introduced to one of our pursuers, Daniela, the maid of the castle, who provides Fiona with some clothes. Something is a bit off with her.
Excuse me, but where are we? And how did I get here?
Yes, Master. We will keep her here for a while. I will make sure she stays comfortable.
One of the horror elements that Haunting Ground delves into is voyeurism. Just listen to our watcher while Fiona is getting changed. There are a number of moments through Haunting Ground in which our pursuer makes their intents clear of why they're after Fiona. They all have their different reasons why, but save for Debilitas, they are all quite unsettling. A number of cutscenes emphasize this focus on voyeurism through camera angles. In her journal, Fiona mentions that the chest area for her outfit is a bit tight. She is well endowed as is. Her given outfit plays this up even more. Fan service? Sure, and especially so with the unlockable outfits after completing the game. But it's also used to flesh out some of the themes and the horror elements in Haunting Ground. It doesn't feel out of place with the narrative. Fiona is something and someone that all these pursuers want.
Beautiful, isn't it? That, my dear, is what you will become in the future. Go ahead. You may touch it. You will be mine, Fiona.
While a bit of Fiona's personality comes out during cutscenes, it's mostly expressed through journal entries that we get filled out throughout the game. A funny note that when you play the game on hard in a repeat playthrough, the notes in the journal come not from Fiona, but from Hewie. The pursuer that we deal with throughout Act 1 is Debilitas. He has a very off-putting appearance, like an experiment gone wrong, which is what he turns out to be. His mental capacity is that of a child, viewing Fiona as a doll to play with. One of his common lines is referring to Fiona as my dolly. His chase music is a great reflection of who he is.
My darling.
We also get introduced to one of the pursuers we'll come across later in the game, Ricardo, the keeper of the castle. Of all the pursuers, his reasoning for wanting Fiona is the most unsettling, which we'll return to later. Beginning to remember, Fiona remembers being in a car crash with her parents who died, leaving her as the heir of this castle. Nice digs. Fiona comes across Hewie, who becomes our faithful companion, and it's here where the game opens up proper. Beyond our pursuers, there are a few deaths that can occur throughout Haunting Ground if we're a bit careless in our explorations. They're not as brutal as the ones seen in Resident Evil 4, with most taking place off-screen, leaving things up to the imagination. If we are killed by pursuers, our deaths will play some audio, unique to each, which are pretty disturbing, leaving you to fill in the blanks. We make our way through this section of the castle, solving light puzzles and coming across more information of what's going on here. I have to say, Haunting Ground is one of the more satisfying success audio cues I've heard in the game. We'll have a boss encounter with Debilitas at the chapel. Each pursuer will have a final encounter. Depending on how you deal with him here, you'll get a couple of different endings. The approach I took here leads to Debilitas surviving.
It's okay, Hewie. He can't come after us anymore. Good boy.
With him out of the way, we have unlocked a new section of the castle where Daniela will be our pursuer. A bit more on the story here. So this castle has been a place of great study of alchemy for a number of generations. Fiona is a descendant of this line. They have been studying immortality and how to achieve it. Through using Azoth, they have been using homunculi to create clones. They have been passed down through generations to continue their work to achieve immortality. Some of their clones have worked out better than others. Debilitas, being a clone that Ricardo created, was a failed experiment that led to his appearance and childlike nature. Azoth is an element that's kept fairly vague, but can be seen as the essence of life, as Daniela says.
Azoth, essence of life, of woman.
While all life has Azoth, Fiona seems to be carrying a great deal of it, which is why everyone's after us. That's what they want. Daniela is a bit of a mystery, with the game being fairly vague of her background.
Dinner is served, miss. Dinner is served, miss.
She seems to be a homunculus, created to be the perfect woman, but she can't feel anything. She's not complete, she can't bear children. It's through taking Fiona's Azoth that she feels she could become complete, or so she thinks. There's something very off about her. There's an optional cutscene where you could find Ricardo interrogating her and she gives off this extremely unsettling smile. In another scene you could miss, the food she's cooking that she serves to Fiona has human hair in it that's blonde. She very well may have fed Fiona's mother to her. There's a lot of these easy to miss moments that add up to a very disturbing experience that isn't outright spelled out for you. Of all the pursuers, Daniela is my favorite one to deal with. Hell, of all the pursuers I've come across in various survival horror titles, she has to be near the top of the list. The way she talks, the robotic-like nature of her steps. Plus, the music that plays while she chases us is really out there, and the most memorable track in the game with just how odd it is. It really captures who Daniela is. It sounds like something MC Ride from Death Grips would rap over. You could also throw her off by getting her to look into mirrors. It's all really disturbing stuff and haunting ground at its best. And there will be points after chasing us where she simply goes back to doing work around the castle, giving us no heed. There's one section here of giving directions to these golems to navigate through these mazes. It's a decent enough puzzle section, but the golems go way too slow, even when you speed them up. Our last encounter with her is great, especially that cutscene prior just showing how damaged Daniela is and how she views Fiona.
You lure the man into your filthy body again and again, and you are allowed to do that. Because you are a precious, precious little princess. Precious, precious little princess.
With Daniela now dead, we'll be dealing with Ricardo. As far as level design goes, this is my favorite section of the game. It's got a great interconnected area with some of the game's best atmosphere. There's a number of homunculi around mumbling away in their own little worlds. Ricardo is carrying a gun, although he doesn't have the best shot. While the music still does a great job of giving off that oh shit vibe, I did find it to be the weakest of the pursuer tracks. The main puzzle in this section is creating a godstone through an alchemy process that requires to take a number of stops throughout the section in the correct order. It's too bad that's Ricardo chasing us during this bit as opposed to Daniela. It's a great section, but having the best pursuer would have made it even better. There's one bit where we'll be separated from Hewie for a time as he opens the door for us. Again, that tension really builds as we don't have Hewie around. And then there's another section once we're in their forest where we're separated from Hewie, in which we're not sure where he went. And one of those nice little moments of showing the relationship, calling for Hewie during these sections leads to a very sad call from Fiona.
Hewie!
We learn that Ricardo is a clone with the exact appearance of Fiona's father. Fiona's father, Ugo, was also a clone, but left the castle to live a normal life. He would meet and marry Ayla, who would give birth to Fiona. Lorenzo Belli, who we will come across shortly, created Ricardo in haste and lacks Azoth, which he seeks to get from Fiona. So yeah, Ricardo more or less is Fiona's uncle here. Ricardo wants to use Fiona to give birth to himself again, so he got some incest going on. For whatever reason, there's this cutscene that doesn't play the first time through the game in which Ricardo gives an unconscious Fiona an ovulation test.
Another 2 or 3 days at most.
Sadly, the next section in the water tower is the worst section of the game. Ricardo is now invisible. As we ascend the tower, there's a number of scripted chases that occurs where he appears. What made the chases so great in Haunting Grounds is the number of options we have of where we could go while being chased. This section here, it's a very linear path, so we're very limited in our options. Thankfully, it's a short section. The next puzzle of lighting up the planets with Hewie is well done and helps show how far your relationship has come with him. We have an encounter with Ricardo on the roof of the tower, at which point we move on to the next section upon defeating him. The final 2 acts are much shorter, more straightforward, with less puzzles, as we're getting through the final stretch here. We'll be dealing with Lorenzo here, someone who we had a phone call with earlier in the game and who have left notes for us.
You must pay attention now, Fiona. Be wary of Ricardo. Your Azoth.
Since he created Ricardo and Fiona's father Ugo, that in a sense makes him Fiona's grandpa. He really gives off that creepy old man vibe.
Poor Fiona. Ricardo put you through quite a bit, didn't he? Unlike Ugo, he was always a troublemaker, a bad apple. Lorenzo Belli created them both, Ricardo and Ugo.
It doesn't help he crawls after us with surprisingly great speed.
Hewie!
Unlike Ricardo, he simply wants to cut up Fiona and take her Azoth, as he could be heard slurping up if we're killed by him. Taking him down like the others is quite satisfying. However, we're not done with Lorenzo yet. He returns as a much younger version of himself.
Fiona, my dear holder of Azoth.
What's going on? You're not my...
Azoth is the essence of life. We alchemists have the ability to convert it into power.
Fun fact, this is Robin Atkin Downes as his voice here. He's done a number of voices, but I best associate him with Cause from the Metal Gear Solid series.
I will now extract the Azoth latent in you, in order to realize the everlasting life of Aureolus Belli.
They played us like a damn fiddle!
He could warp around and cast spells. We have a final encounter with him where he appears to perish by falling into a pit of lava. Of course, things aren't that easy. As we escape, he returns on fire in a fairly frustrating end sequence. You have to push away this falling statue. If you're not fast enough, he'll catch up and kill you. I wish Fiona gave him the Heather Mason treatment and kicking him repeatedly to make sure he was dead. With that, we get one of 2 endings, whether we killed Debilitas or spared him, in which Fiona and Hewie leave.
Hewie?
but there are also 2 other endings we could get. But before we cover those, there's a really interesting finding that I only just discovered when putting together this video. In the ending credits, there's a conversation that happens between Fiona's parents, as confirmed by the composer. It's hard to hear, but when you see the lyrics, it really paints her parents in a different light. It seems that Fiona's mother was seeking her Azoth. How did she know about it? Was she aware of the Bellies' work throughout the centuries? Who was she exactly? This is never expanded on. Some of the wording is fairly vague on whether Fiona's father was okay with this. This also gets me to see the game in a different light. Was it just by happenstance that at the beginning of the game we were close by the castle when the accident happened? Where were they heading? Were they going to the castle? This is left open-ended. One other ending you can get during a repeat playthrough allows you to get a key to exit the castle much earlier, which leads to a amusing scene of Lorenzo chasing after Fiona.
Don't go, Fiona. My life, my Azoth, Fiona.
And then there's the worst ending. In order to get this one, you need to have a bad relationship with Hewie. Remember that scene in the forest where we're separated from Hewie? Well, this time when Fiona awakens after fainting, there is no Hewie to save us, and Ricardo gets his way. Haunting Ground is one of those titles that's well worth checking out. It's one of the better survival horror titles from a console generation that saw a number of classic titles in the genre released on the regular. Sadly, due to poor marketing and timing just after the release of Resident Evil 4, didn't get the props it deserved at the time. But it's one of those titles that I'd love to see remastered due to its limited availability, and to introduce players who missed it at the time. Someone suggested that perhaps Capcom should remaster a number of these titles from this time frame into a collection, which I think is a fantastic idea. When I first played it a few years ago, one of the first thoughts I had was, I wish I played this one sooner. If you have a PS2 lying around and have some disposable income, or some luck at pawn shops, give Haunting Ground a look. While it still has some issues, emulation works for it as well. It's a wonderful title that I hope more people decide to take a look at. Thanks for watching. Do all those things that the algorithm likes. If you'd like to support the channel further, please consider my Patreon or becoming a YouTube member. Thanks for coming by.
Oh.